you guys hear that? Well, with the sound of an airplane in the background, welcome back to Podcasting on a Plane. This is my view of aviation from both sides of the mic. It's where I give you straight talk about the greatest thing ever, which of course is aviation, right? My name is Brandon Gonzalez. I'm an air traffic controller at a busy general aviation airport in the West Coast. And I've got a 25-year background in aviation as a controller, as a pilot, as a flight instructor and Part 141 check airman. I was an aircraft salesman for a while, a ramper for a major airline, a line service guy. That's where it all started. And there's some other stuff in there I'm not proud of. I won't get to here. But nonetheless, this aviation podcast is my little way of serving the aviation community for now. So with any luck, you're getting something out of the podcast that'll help you in your aviation endeavors, whatever they might be. Now here we talk about aviation from as many angles as possible. And if you've got a perspective I'm missing, well, the request lines are open 24/7. Podcastingonaplane.com/contact is where you can talk with me. And while you're there, you can learn more about me and the guests we've had on the show. You can listen to past episodes, record audio messages and feedback, send me an email, or learn how to become a valued supporter. And on that note, as always, I want to thank my generous patrons on patreon.com for keeping this show in the air. If you want to talk or schedule a ground lesson, podcastingonaplane.com/contact is where you can schedule that. And actually, speaking of interacting with you guys, there's a few emails I've been meaning to get to in the inbox. Sorry, it's been a while, but if you sent me an email, we'll get to it, I promise. All right, the first email here is from Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Subject is Richard Collins Podcast. And Sarah says, Brandon, I'm Richard Collins' daughter. Whoa. I just listened to your podcast and I wanted to thank you for the kind words about my father and grandfather. Yeah, of course. She says, I never can hear enough. And I'm happy they made such an impact on the aviation community. Best, Sarah. Hang on, guys. I'm going to be right back. Okay, we're back. And all right, I emailed Sarah back. We went back and forth a little bit, and she has some pictures. Wow, she has some personal pictures from Mr. Collins that she wants to send. Well, okay, cool. And wow, okay, I can't wait till those pictures get here. And as soon as they do, you guys, make sure you're following the podcast on Instagram, and I'm going to put those up there so you guys can check out what she sent me. Incredible. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was my pleasure and my honor, actually, to make that episode. It was by far the least I could do to honor him and all of his different contributions to aviation media. So yes, my pleasure, Sarah, my pleasure. All right. You know what? Let's move on from mail now. Okay, we'll do some more letters next time, but let's move on. Now, all right, I've been so busy lately, I hardly even noticed it was June, and now the month is half over. But I finally had the chance to catch up on some reading. And one of the first magazines I catch up on, anytime I catch up, is Flying. And I'm about done with the current issue, but it was the May issue, actually, last month. And in addition to, of course, all the usual great writing, it had a really particular little gem that I want to share with you guys. The On-Course letter by Editor-in-Chief Stephen Pope. I know a lot of people skip over the editor's letter in magazines, but this one's worth taking a second glance if you still have the issue. So what's it about? Well, you guys remember that 11th hour push to privatize ATC where they kind of tried to sneak it in at the last second, hoping no one would notice? Well, Bill Schuster had actually already announced that he wasn't going to continue the push to privatize ATC, but then that wasn't the case. So editor Stephen Pope of Flying has a few thoughts on that matter that I'm about to read for you. And of course, I'm going to tread lightly here for obvious reasons. Now, I don't want to get into whether or not I feel like ATC should be privatized or not. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with my employer or the government. All I'm saying is that when, shady political stuff happens, I'm just glad to be part of a community that takes note and fights back. So here's what he says. The Power of Truth by Stephen Pope, examining how general aviation stopped ATC privatization, at least for now. For general aviation interests involved in a knockdown, drag-out brawl over ATC privatization, the news was stunning. House Chairman and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Bill Schuster, in late February, dropped the bombshell that he would end his effort to privatize the air traffic control system in the United States. He didn't have the votes he needed to pass H.R. 2997, what was going to be the Pennsylvania Republicans' signature piece of legislation, a bill that sought to hand over billions of dollars of taxpayer-funded air traffic control infrastructure to a corporatized entity that the airlines would, in effect, own. Schuster knew he had been beaten. It was time to end the fight. General aviation leaders celebrated that night, I'm sure. An airline CEO somewhere probably kicked his dog. My reaction was neither one of celebration nor shock. Well, okay, I was a little shocked. But when I heard the news, all I could think was that this fight isn't over. Not by a long shot. I don't mean that Schuster was setting up a trap with his 11th hour decision to end his full court press for ATC privatization. But let's face it, huge sums of money are on the line. And too much time and effort's been spent by the airlines and their allies in Congress to let the dream of ATC reform die. As I've noted before, plans for a privatized ATC corporation are nothing new. General Aviation waged a similar fight in the 90s during the Clinton administration when the airlines wanted to create an independent ATC corporation operated under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation. GA pushed back and won that round too. This fight will spring to the surface again, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. My worry is when general aviation groups are called upon to rally the troops once more, GA user fees will be back in play, along with new doses of demagoguery and class warfare, which were used this time in a pathetic attempt to pit average Americans against the, quote, evil private jet owners, end quote. Thank goodness the public was too smart to fall for the airline's dirty tricks. And that's what this fight boiled down to in the end. General Aviation never wavered for an instant from talking straight and standing up for what was right. Airlines for America, the trade group that led the push for ATC privatization as Schuster's strongest ally, relied on distortions and half-truths that thankfully succeeded in fooling no one. Credit for this victory goes to a long list of people, starting with the heads of the aviation organizations that represent the interests of general aviation, such as Ed Bolin, the National Business Aviation Association, Mark Baker at the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Jack Pelton at EAA, and Pete Bunce at the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, who refused to back down from one of the toughest fights of their careers. GA prevailed, and for that, we should all celebrate. Next time around, we can take solace knowing we have the ideal blueprint for victory. Tell the truth and fight like hell. And Mr. Pope, if you're listening, well said, sir. All right, it's been a couple episodes since we've talked about this, so here it is again. Time to talk about FBO pricing. And this one's a little more snarky than usual. Now, the topic was covered in both flying and AOPA, and frankly, in several other places too. But I'm going to read the AOPA article first this time. Now, this article is titled, "The FAA Decides AOPA's Asheville Complaint." The agency argues pilots can be charged for the FBO services they do not want or use. June 12, 2018, by Joe Kildea. The FAA's Southern Region Airports Division has decided against AOPA's Part 13 complaint over egregious fixed-base operator fees and unreasonable access at Asheville Regional Airport in North Carolina. A June 7th letter clears the way for Signature, the sole FBO at Asheville, to continue to charge general aviation pilots for unnecessary and unwanted services. Although informal at this stage, AOPA believes the decision contradicts existing FAA policies and could be the beginning of a dangerous precedent for many other airports across the country. AOPA General Counsel Ken Mead said, quote, "We believe the FAA Southern Region decision is incorrect and inconsistent with the ruling in Orange County, as well as the guidance FAA headquarters issued as recently as December 2017. Most airports and FBOs are doing a great job, but in situations where that isn't the case, we will continue to fight for reasonable access, transparent and public posting of fees, and competition where practical. Are these three simple, fair, and reasonable things too much to ask for? I think not." End quote. In 2017, AOPA, on behalf of affected pilots, filed 3 similar Part 13 complaints against 3 airports: Asheville, Key West in Florida, and Waukegan in Illinois. All 3 airports have one FBO. Guess who? Signature Flight Support. And that controls all ramp space available for transient GA aircraft and imposes high fees for services that pilots often don't request or need. Signature is a subsidiary of BBA Aviation, which is traded on the London Stock Exchange. All 3 airports also receive FAA Airport Improvement Program grants, which means they're bound by federal obligations to make the airport available for public use and to ensure FBOs impose only fair and non-discriminatory fees on users. AOPA withdrew the complaint against Waukegan after the airport announced a free transient tie-down area and then worked with the FBO to reduce the price of the self-service avgas. In April, AOPA announced a watch list of 10 additional airports that potentially have similar issues to Asheville, Key West, and Waukegan. The association is also working with industry leaders throughout AOPA's Airport Access Advisory Panel to protect reasonable access at public use airports. According to the decision, the FAA believes Signature's use of, quote, fair market rates for its services at Asheville is in compliance with federal grant obligations, but AOPA's argument is that Signature maintains a monopoly over transient GA parking in the Asheville area, which gives it exclusive control over this market. And when Signature controls the entire market, the so-called fair market rate is simply whatever Signature FBO wants to charge pilots. Mead asked, how could there be a market rate without competition? The FAA's decision is based on the false assumption that competition exists. The implications are clear. Signature will continue to charge pilots for services they do not need, want, or use, a business practice the FAA calls common. It would also mean that private FBOs at federally funded public airports can play by a different set of rules than the municipally operated FBOs and airports providing aeronautical services to the airlines. Another Mead quote, "It is fundamentally offensive for the FAA to imply that it's an acceptable business practice to make pilots pay for services they don't request or need," end quote, said Mead. Later in the article, Mead says again, quote, existing FAA policy requires airports, including municipally operated FBOs, to charge pilots only for the cost of using any transient ramp they offer to the public. The decision now allows airports to hand over that ramp to a monopoly position FBO and allow it to charge whatever they want. It makes no sense, sets a scary precedent, and contradicts guidance the FAA published in December 2017, end quote. I'm going to skip a couple paragraphs here and move on to the end of the article. It sums up perfectly what AOPA's position is. While the decision does not set a binding precedent for other airports, Mead believes it's indicative of a flawed perspective at the FAA that has allowed certain monopoly position FBOs to impose unreasonable fees on GA users and could worsen. He says, this shows just how important our work is and will not stop until the FAA and the problem locations understand that fees imposed on GA pilots at publicly funded airports cannot just be whatever they think they can get away with, said Mead. Again, that article from AOPA, Joe Kildia, he's the AOPA Senior Director of Communications. A link, of course, is in the show notes. The story was also covered by Flying Magazine, and since they aren't the complainant, well, they're a little less biased. So let's see what they have to say. This article by Flying Magazine. The FAA rejects AOPA's pricing complaint at Asheville Airport. The agency says claims of excessive airport and FBO fees aren't supported by the facts. By Stephen Pope, June 12, 2018. The FAA's Southern Region has rejected the AOPA's claim that egregious FBO pricing at Asheville in North Carolina violates federal airport grant assurances, calling the Part 13 complaint the association filed last summer unpersuasive. The FAA Southern Region Airports Division wrote a June 7th letter to AOPA General Counsel Ken Mead that an investigation conducted over several months agreed with the Asheville Airport Authority's assertion that the fees charged by the airport's sole FBO are, quote, necessary and reasonable. The agency went on to say it determined the allegations made by AOPA on its complaint, quote, are not supported and no further review is warranted, end quote. The issue swirled around AOPA's contention that some airports and FBOs are charging its members for services they don't ask for or need, effectively denying pilots affordable access to those facilities. And in rejecting AOPA's complaint, the FAA noted FBOs spend millions of dollars to build facilities and compete for leasehold at airports with a clear understanding that they'll charge aircraft owners fees for use of those facilities. The agency noted that the FBO investment by Signature Flight Support at Asheville included construction of the General Aviation Terminal Building, large commercial hangars, 68 T hangars, aircraft maintenance facilities, office space, a fuel farm, and a self-service fuel pump. Quote, in addition to this initial investment, the FAA wrote, the FBO was required to spend another $750,000 in leasehold improvements, including at a minimum improvements to the south and middle ramps, as well as a future financial commitment assumed in the lease agreements. The FAA said it found no evidence that FBO fees at Asheville Regional Airport are excessive. The ruling's a serious blow against AOPA's crusade to change fee policies at about a dozen general aviation airports served by single FBOs. In nearly every case, the FBO in question has been Signature Flight Support, which levies ramp fees on transient single-engine piston airplanes at the affected airports of $29, a charge that's waived with a purchase of 7 gallons of fuel. Charges for turboprops and jets are higher, of course, often running to hundreds of dollars. The FAA said it reviewed the Asheville Airport's grant assurances and found they complied with federal law. In considering whether Signature's fees are reasonable, the FAA added, we found AOPA's assertions to be unpersuasive. The National Air Transport Association, which represents airport businesses like FBOs, said AOPA's actions against airports and FBOs reflected a misunderstanding of the economics of aviation businesses, the pricing of services, and airport FBO relationships. NATA President Marty Hiller says NATA and its aviation business members are pleased that the FAA took the necessary time and steps to understand the complexity of the issue and to consider the views of all stakeholders. The FAA's complaint review letter illustrates the profound role of airport sponsors in upholding their federal obligations and ensuring fees are reasonable and access to the airport is available to all users, end quote. In a statement, AOPA's Mead said the association will fight on. Using all available avenues, we will continue to fight for reasonable access, transparent and public pricing and competition, he said. And as we heard in the previous article, it is also fundamentally offensive for the FAA to imply that it's an acceptable business practice to make pilots pay for services they don't request or need. Again, that article from Flying Magazine. So what do you guys think of all this? I know I've gone to several, locations of that particular FBO, and yeah, there's usually a fee. And like they said, it's usually right around $30. But what about you guys? Do you feel like you've been charged unreasonable fees somewhere? Has Signature being the sole FBO at a certain airport prevented you from going there? Have you gone somewhere else? Have you given them your business? Do you have any great stories about alternatives? What do you think about monopoly FBOs? Podcastingonaplane.com/contact is where you can send an email or comment on that. You can record it if you want us to all hear your voice, or you can just send me an email and I'll read it, if that's okay with you, of course. Just let me know in the comments. But get back to me, and I want to share what you guys think about this with as many people as possible. All right. Now, Speaking of flying magazine that is, I've got a special treat for you guys today. And this is my favorite kind of interaction with you all. The best landing I ever made, but this time with a twist. What does it have to do with Flying Magazine, you say? Well, who knows the name Rob Mark? That's right, a senior editor at Flying Magazine, the publisher of jetwine.com, and the Aviation Minute podcast, which if you don't listen to, go check that out as soon as this one's done and subscribe. And you're going to hear a lot of stuff like you're about to hear right now. His Aviation Minute podcasts are great. It's usually a 5 or 6 minute recording on his or a contributor's thoughts on a particular aviation matter, and they're all so good. Go check it out. He agreed to record one for my show. And again, I'm honored to be able to give this to you guys. So let's hear what Rob Mark says, not about the scariest landing he ever made, but about the scariest takeoff.
When I was only a mere pup of a student pilot, my instructor dutifully warned me of the various plateaus I was going to face in flight training. There'll be time, he said, when you'll have 6 or 7 uneventful solo hours under your belt, and you're going to do something stupid and scare the hell out of yourself. Well, sure enough, I did. Quite a few times, actually. But he also told me to watch for the couple of 100-hour syndrome. That's when you saunter around the flight ops office and reply with an almost, "I've forgotten how many hours I really have," kind of nonchalance to those who seem to covet logged hours. Who would have thought I'd be looking back at another plateau in that nonchalant cycle of flying, as I am right now, thinking of how lucky I even am to be alive to tell the story. There was a time when I was managing an FBO's flight department. The job and I were made for each other, and I arrived in my new office with almost all of the flight instructor ratings as well as an ATP certificate and a few thousand-plus hours. Because of the extremely heavy charter load we were having one summer, there were few people around the airport to test aircraft for the shop. I fell into that duty with enthusiasm. It gave me a chance to fly a little by myself and got me out of the office every so often. One humid July afternoon, our shop foreman strolled into the office and asked whether I could take an old Aztec out for a test flight to check the operation of the right engine. I peered through the blinds of my office window and spotted an ancient Piper on the ramp. It was one of those really old Aztecs that looks like an Apache with a big tail and a longer nose. Now, I knew full well I'd only been in an Aztec twice in my life, and one of those flights was in the back seat, but hey, wasn't I a multi-engine pilot? Wasn't I now a multi-engine flight instructor? And wasn't I really current in the Cessna 310 and the 400 series Cessnas and the Barons? Besides, I was an ATP. Now, the Aztec's owner, a man in his early 70s, wanted to come along, but was more than happy to have me fly the machine. Imagine the flight department manager taking the time to check out my airplane, he said. Now that's service. I had some trouble getting the engine started until I managed to find the master switch, but I waved to the shop foreman and called DuPage ground for taxi. As I moved to the runway, I noticed the airspeed indicator. It was old, really old. It wasn't even marked with the VYSE speeds. I was cocky, but I wasn't anybody's fool, so I queried the owner. "Oh, blue line's about over there," he said, pointing to a spot near 100 miles an hour. It was about that time that I began to feel those first small, almost imperceptible beads of sweat break out on the back of my neck, telling me I should stop right now and get all the facts straight. But then, I was an ATP and a multi-engine flight instructor, wasn't I? I proceeded to the run-up area, and of course that's when I noticed there was no checklist in the airplane. I knew the fuel pumps had to be on for takeoff and landing, and the old cigar checklist seemed to work out okay. When I got to the autopilot, I saw that the switch to turn it on and off was a push-pull type attached to a dull, silver ball-bearing knob. There were no markings on the autopilot anywhere, so I looked over at the owner. He said, "Don't worry, push is off." I nodded. I had no need to worry about the heading bug since the autopilot was off, so I just left it set where it was, pointing due west. As I brought in takeoff power, we rolled down runway 15, and no sooner had we lifted off than the aircraft started a steep turn to the right. It took both of my hands to hold it even close to level. My eyes, not accustomed to the panel instrument placement, darted from place to place until they landed on the manifold pressure for both engines. The right one was down to 16 inches. "Geez, we're losing the right engine," I said loud enough to be heard over the noise of the wind in the good engine. We had about 100 feet between us and the ground. The tower was yelling to know if we needed help. I told my co-pilot to turn the radios down because I knew I was on my own at this point. Just as I was about to reach up and feather the right engine, I noticed that the right throttle was retarded about halfway on the quadrant. Obviously, the friction lock hadn't held when I let go of the throttles. I immediately pushed it forward to find the manifold pressure returned to normal. I had 2 engines again, but the aircraft was still fighting me to head west. West! My right hand dove for the bug on the autopilot and turned it to the 190-degree heading we were passing through. The aircraft immediately righted itself. I didn't touch another thing until we had 1,000 feet under us. At 2,000 feet, I turned the bug on the autopilot and the aircraft immediately responded. Halfway through the turn, I pulled the little silver knob from the autopilot and the system disengaged. I glared at the owner and, well, he just shrugged his shoulders. By this time, I was dripping with sweat. I turned the aircraft around and we landed safely. As we taxied in, I wasn't sure whether I should just kick myself or submit to 20 lashes from our chief pilot. With all the experience I had behind me, thousands of hours, when it came right down to it, I'd simply reached another plateau of arrogance about my ability. As I drove home that night, I vowed to try and remember that I was, even with a fat logbook, just a pup. A little more experienced than some, but still just a pup. For Jetwine, this is Rob Mark in Chicago.
Wow, what a great story. Mr. Rob Mark, thank you so much for recording that. I'm honored to be able to put it on this podcast. If you aren't listening to his podcast, The Aviation Minute, I'll put a link in the show notes. Make sure you go check that out. And you can subscribe and check out his website too. It's, of course, jetwine.com. Our website, of course, is Podcasting on a Plane. And while you're there, you can find links to all the ways to follow this show. You can listen to past episodes, follow us on social media, and learn how to become a valued supporter on Patreon. If you find value in the podcast and you want to support the show in a non-financial way, just head over to iTunes maybe and leave a nice positive review. It'll help a lot of other people find the show, and I'd really appreciate it too. Oh, that's all for now. Thanks for listening. Your frequency change is approved. Till next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.